So just what I, oh God, it's slightly, anyway, won't lose too much, I hope. But yes, as Joe sort of suggested, he suggested we talk about the sort of the journey of myself and the company Rezonence that I founded, and how we came to do what we do and why, and the kind of problems we look to solve. But I thought that when I was thinking about putting the presentation together, I realized that actually one of the things, the sort of underlying themes was we are facing a sort of a industry, certainly within the digital advertising industry, it's going through a period of change, rapid change. There's lots of tech evolution, big players, Google, Facebook, all that's happening, data. But within that, there's also been plenty of opportunity to innovate and do things differently, and there's sort of lots of opportunities there. So hence the title, Change and Innovation. So anyway, but I think given that Rezonence to some sense was so closely bound to me because I started it, I thought I'd start off with a little bit about myself. So sorry, I won't go on too long. But just my background, I actually trained as a physicist, and I spent time at the UK Atomic Energy Authority working on their sort of fusion program out in Culham. That's tokamak, as it's called. That's basically the inside of the fusion reactor. I like to think of myself as still as a scientist, even though it's been a very long time since I've ever got anywhere near an equation. But what I'd like to do is sort of apply a relatively sort of, let's say, scientific form of rigorous analysis, thinking to any kind of challenge that I come across, and try and solve it in a sort of a proper way, like from the ground up, and say, like, does a solution actually properly solve the problem? Okay. So that's, I think that's probably enough about me. And well, actually no, there's one more slide. But like a lot of scientists and physicists, I didn't stay in science because it doesn't pay very well at all. And what a lot of physicists do, like myself, they end up in banking. So that's where I ended up. And I actually spent 13 years in banking. And I was what they call a quant. My job was to build algorithmic trading strategies and let them run. And the idea was that they would sort of essentially to outperform people. And actually, a lot of my algorithms got better than real people. I mean, this was we didn't call it AI and big data then. It was just algorithms outperforming people. And yeah, I was pretty good at that. How actually the kind of, it's weird for me when people say, how did you go from banking to media? I mean, that kind of makes no sense. And actually, I made the switch when my wife was due to give birth to our first son in about 3 months' time. So people thought I was completely mad, and my friends thought I was going through a midlife crisis. Maybe I was, but but what actually the trigger for me was that I'd noticed that actually my algorithms were short-selling publishers. So publishing stocks were being downgraded left, right, and center, and my algorithms were sort of picking up on that. And I thought that was a bit odd. So I went and spoke to a media analyst within the bank that I worked for. I worked with Deutsche Bank at the time, and they and he said, well, actually your algorithms are right. This is, publishing stocks are in huge amounts of trouble. This whole print to digital shift is completely killing them off because they just can't make the same level of revenue. And it was to do with the sort of, if you look at if you're a regular reader, let's say, of a Guardian or Telegraph or something, they could make many hundreds of pounds off you over the course of the year from the cover price and the advertising. But if you just switch to digital only, and most of these titles were ad funded models, they would make, like, let's say, from £500 a year on average down to about 50 pence per year. It's crazy, the amount of difference, but the cost of production of journalism was all the same. So that was a real problem, which it was leading to what I would say is sort of a broken internet. And a lot of people talk about the internet because what's happening is, in their publishers going, okay, we'll give our content for free, we'll get lots of audience, plenty of audience, we can then sell banners on them. But actually, banners don't deliver a huge amount of revenue. So what happens is you end up with having to put more ads on it. Now, certainly from the user's point of view, it's like a horrible user experience. They're getting very good at sort of subconsciously blanking out ads. The stat is, on average, a person is exposed to about nearly 1,000 digital marketing messages a day, apparently. I mean, how many of those 1,000 do people remember on average? It's like most people are getting very good at blocking it out, and that's not even people not using ad blockers, which means publishers are not getting revenue, so to compensate, they put even more ads on the page. And all this, the advertiser's not getting a great deal because now your one ad is in one of 5, and it's all cluttered. So you're kind of getting this weird kind of debt spiral, right? It's just constantly getting worse and worse. So it felt like, well, actually, and remember, this was me thinking all this while I was still in the bank, is just sort of doing analysis, going, well, this is crazy. I mean, it doesn't look sustainable at all. How do you solve this? So for me, I was like, that's the question. I sort of said, well, how do you solve this thing? How can you, surely there must be a better way, because if you looked at the underlying stats, people are actually consuming more content online than ever before, so you'd be like, well, actually, more content was being produced in a way. Yes, there was lots of fake articles, there's lots of clickbaity headlines and all that, all because to try and get more impressions, right? Because it was all on a CPM impression-based world. But my thing was like, how can you try and build a system where you've got a better deal for advertisers, publishers, and because it feels like they should be. The underlying mechanics were there. People spending more time online, the publishers actually having the opportunity to reach a greater audience. Advertisers had digital advertising at their disposal, which is much more effective than obviously a standard out-of-home banner or print. I mean, you can interact with this thing. So it felt like you had the raw materials to create a better ecosystem, but the entire economy was getting into a sort of worse situation. So to solve the problem for me was, I sort of said, well, okay, let's just focus on the ad-funded model. For publishers to sort of get to be in a better situation, we had to essentially, that's gone back very quickly, is that all the, okay, something, it seems to have done that automatically. Anyway, so what can we, for me it was like, well, what do advertisers really want from their banner advertising, right? When they serve an ad, you want it to be seen, obviously, and your message understood. So I started looking at that aspect and saying, how can the system deliver more value to advertisers? And to deliver more value to advertisers, I sort of said, well, what's taking value away right now, and see, can we fix that? So let's say you're buying a whole bunch of impressions of sort of, let's say, people that you want to put your ad in front of. According to the standard stats, sort of Google, about 30% of all banners are sort of lost to fraud. Lots of different types. Apparently there were over 20 types of online fraud, but this includes bots, ads standing on content farms, not even being actually delivered, but you think they're being delivered. I don't know if he's doing that. Okay, so 30% fraud. Okay, it's just going through very quickly, but basically, if you've got 30% fraud, another 50% being lost to viewability, and then apparently less than 10% of people who've actually been exposed to a banner ad will even notice it, right? So you've got, at the end of it, you've got like, you're doing well if you get 2 to 3% of your banners actually being noticed. Now, for the message to be absorbed is then again actually another hurdle, right? So when you might actually notice a banner, but then as an advertiser, you don't know if the person just absorbed the message of a brand or just gone, oh, they've used a very nice looking model, and that's it. They haven't actually absorbed the product message. So for me, it was like, well, actually, if you can come up with a system where you can remove all those things and actually prove back to an advertiser, that someone not only saw your ad, but I can prove to you that they also understood the message, surely that's going to be more valuable. That's a more valuable form of advertising. How do you do that? I was still in the bank at this stage. This thing seems to just, maybe it's on a timer, and it's like, giving that as a subtle hint to keep moving. But the thing is, I was still at my bank, thinking about this thing at my desk, and a colleague of mine came and sort of said, well, look, that basically told me it sort of done a task that I'd set him. And I was skeptical about it. I was like, not sure. So I said, well, if you can answer this question correctly, then I'll know you've done the task. And to his credit, he actually answered it correctly. And that's when it hit me. I was like, well, that's what I'm going to do. And that's maybe the solution. You show someone an ad, and then you quiz them on it. right? And if they get it right, then they've seen the ad and they've understood the message. And that actually led to the first iteration of our product. Let me show you now how it works. So imagine you're reading an article in the publisher. So a couple of paragraphs in, what we do is we put an ad in the middle. I've taken the liberty of, maybe a brand there. And what we do is there's a quiz aspect of it just below, and the content below it is hidden. Now, what a user has to do to unlock their own thing is they just have to answer a simple question about the brand. It's basically the key message turned into a question, and which they can do by clicking on the correct answer. One click, and the rest of the article is revealed, and you've also got what we call a response in there. That can be a standard banner, it can be a video, it can be whatever you want it. But it's really, really straightforward. Right, but critically, two things are important here. The advertiser in this model only pays when that engagement is delivered, right? So if he showed that banner, essentially a free wall, we call it a free wall, by the way, because it's like a paywall, but you pay with your time and attention from a user's point of view. If we show that free wall like 100 times and no one engaged, the advertiser doesn't pay anything. You only pay when that question's answered. Because for us, that was proof. Well, we showed you a banner ad, essentially. We then quizzed them on it. And if they got the answer right, we can be quite confident that they understood. They paid attention, they saw the ad. So we got rid of the viewability issue, we got rid of the ad blindness issue. We only work with premium publishers, so you got rid of the fraud issue. And the way it works, it's immune to bots, anyway, as of now. And the only pushback we used to get in the past is that, oh, look, this feels a bit intrusive, our user's going to be upset about it. As it turns out, they weren't. I mean, as a business, early days in the business, we thought that might be a big issue. We weren't actually sure if it would be so intrusive that people would just not bother and we'd be out of business very quickly. But actually, something really interesting happened is that our engagement rates kept climbing the more we were in business. And what we realized is that once someone's engaged with one of these and they understand, oh, this was quite straightforward, it was just answer the question, bang, then I can go about my work. The engagement rate goes up much more. If you've engaged the free wall once, you're almost certainly likely to engage again, essentially. It's the first time, because most people are a bit wary about ads, it's the first time that they see one, they're like, oh, don't know what this is going to do. Is it going to take me elsewhere, pop up, do something funky? So from a user experience, we know now over 5 years and millions of things, it actually isn't. And the key win from a reader's point of view is, because this is much more effective, you can serve less of these. You don't have to serve, banners again and then again. We'll talk more about brand recall later, but one of these delivers much more brand recall than even multiple banners.
Sorry, can I ask a question, or do you want to say?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Just a question on that, because I know when Facebook introduced their ads in between video content, I stopped watching the rest of the video.
Right.
Because I didn't care enough.
Yeah.
Did you have any of that where consumers just didn't read the rest of the article because it was too intrusive?
It's a very good question. So what we've done lots of research on that. And what we've found is that it's the quality of the article that will determine whether you carry on reading.
Okay.
So if I would say, if that video was really interesting to you, you would have carried on, right?
Yeah.
So in fact, it's created a very interesting feedback loop for us with our publishers, because with publishers, we're able to tell them what their genuinely engaging articles are versus not. So essentially what we've noticed is that if it's an article is very clickbaity, as in it's just got an alluring headline and the content itself is rubbish, it will get a very low engagement rate. And interestingly enough, unlike a slight digression, but it's actually maybe a good time to do this, it's like the CPM model where you're just paying for banners actually incentivizes clickbaity headlines, because the moment the page is refreshed, as far as the publisher is concerned, they're getting paid. Your ad is essentially a call is being made, whereas with the engagement-based system, they actually have to write good content that people are willing to engage and carry on reading, because if they don't, they won't get the engagements and they're not getting paid. So we actually think that, although I wasn't going to cover this, but this actually creates a much more virtuous circle rather than the standard banner version. And actually we have an optimizer now that's able to actually pick out the more engaging articles and only put a free wall when we feel that the article is engaging enough. That it's so you're not annoying the user, because the user on average going, yeah, I'm prepared to answer that, to keep going. Now I'll just think, and to some extent, although I'd come up with the early version of the product, and we were by this stage now, I'd sort of launched the company. I had met Joe at Unilever. He was kind enough to give us one of our early trials. But we had still not validated the business. I mean, from the start of the story to kind of building the free wall and launch was sort of almost 2 years. So I spent about 2 years doing the research because I didn't know anything about media as an entire, a complete outsider. And in fact, I think that helped me quite a lot because by being an outsider, I didn't have the sort of the rules, if you will. I didn't know the rules, what was possible, what was not possible. In fact, a lot of people I met in media, even now, sometimes say, well, look, I get it, free wall's so simple, but I don't think I would have ever been able to come up with it because I would have thought, you can't do something like that. Whereas I didn't know you're not meant to interrupt a user, if you will. Oops, sorry. So, yeah, this is definitely on a timer, right? Are you nudging it along?
Would you like me to change all of your transitions to on click?
Oh, are they not on click? Oh yeah, if you can do that, please. Thank you. Okay, yeah, if you can make it on click, please. Thank you.
I'll just modify the backup deck.
Okay, fine, okay, well, okay.
If you keep going on that, then
so one of the things we wanted to do was actually ensure that the, for the success of the business, that what we were delivering actually delivered value to the advertiser, right? Actually delivered ROI. And yes, so although the company was a baby company, it just got going, I knew that its long-term success only depended if fundamentally an advertiser got a benefit from using us versus other formats. And obviously the two things from my point of view when I was doing the research again was like, the two things that, I'm sorry, I'm sure this is all kind of probably quite obvious to you, but for me at the time it was totally not, was that for good advertising you needed, you obviously need reach, which in the digital ecosystem it's relatively straightforward to get, but you also needed to basically effectively educate your audience. And this is the bit I felt that where we did more research and I felt we could do a whole lot better, which was on the education piece, which we felt banners were falling down because they were just being ignored, which meant their ability to educate was limited. But if you think about education, I said, well, let's look at the world of education. I mean, how does the world of education educate people? And I sort of did some reading up on that, and there were sort of things on neuroscience, and apparently your brain absorbs information 2 different ways. So there's one called passive review, and the other is active recall. So passive review, is learning through observation. So when you see something, if I were to say the word ball to you in a foreign language, you're technically learning that, but the chance of you remembering that are quite low. Active recall is learning through repetition. So it would be the equivalent of me saying, now can you please repeat that word back to me? And basically the moment you do that, the chance of you remembering go up by a huge factor. And it's, more extreme version would be watching someone playing tennis versus picking up a racket and hitting the ball yourself, right? And no sort of prizes for guessing how the world's education system works. It's all based on active recall. That's why you've got homework, that's why you've got tests, that's why teachers say, now repeat after me. And this is the key point that we realized that what actually free wall was doing was tapping into the active sort of recall part by essentially getting people to repeat the message by answering that quiz. We were tapping into active recall. So I remember when Joe first gave us a test, he also ran a brand recall study on us, and we got a very, very high score on it. In fact, surprisingly, I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was like 86% brand recall, which was very high at the time. And actually we thought, well, okay, that's really interesting. So that's obviously a very important thing for advertisers. Brand recall comes up again and again. So what we decided to do is do a bit more study into that. And we run lots of tests, and the most interesting one we did was actually with a company called Neuroinsight, where they put sort of brain caps on your head, like things like that, electrodes, and they actually measure what's known as memory encoding. So memory encoding, apparently they can measure when the brain's actually, when you're actually connecting something to memory, they can measure that. They can actually see the brain does certain different things, and you can actually measure if that information is being stored in the brain or no action's being taken. And interesting enough, your brain works in a way that it's not like you're always remembering everything and then you gradually forget. It has to cross a sort of threshold before you remember something. So the common thing is like, to get here from the road to here, I had to sort of walk up a number of steps. I've down a few steps. Now, I have no idea. My brain didn't remember that. It just discarded that information immediately. Whereas the birth of my child is sort of unlikely to forget. So, and what happens, so therefore actually, it means that, one was above a threshold and one was below a threshold. And in terms of advertising, what this other company, actually really interesting work, so look them up if you're on NeuroInsight. They're able to sort of measure what type of ads sort of, and at what points, if it's, let's say, a video ad, the sort of the threshold from a memory encoding point of view go over that threshold, so the things are being written into the memory, you're going to start remembering, versus actually nothing. This ad is going to be completely forgotten. And if nothing is written into memory, then essentially your brain, if you just think of it from a scientific point of view, has no information to change its future behavior, which is ultimately what advertising is about, right? To some extent, you're trying to change the future behavior of consumers in a manner which is beneficial to you. So, and again, with free wall, what we saw is that free wall actually regularly gets over the threshold because it taps into active recall, but also actually it's linked with the physical action. And when more parts of your body are associated with something, you're more likely to remember something. The easiest example to give you that is like, it's like your password or PIN. If someone were to just say, can you recite your password? It's kind of quite hard, but it's much easier to type it out. It's because that's how the brain is an associative machine, essentially. When you, and the combination of repeating the message plus clicking on the right answer essentially taps into all of that, and you get much higher memories of memory encoding. So, long story short, basically, it's, we now had a product that fundamentally fixes sort of technical issues with banners, with the ad blindness, visibility, and fraud aspects, but we fundamentally also had a product which we now could scientifically demonstrate that delivered real value to an advertiser. So, and ultimately what we believed was actually, because of the way people work, we were able to demonstrate time and again with publishers, advertisers, and the readers that we were creating actually a much more sustainable value exchange proposition for the entire ecosystem, right? So because this was delivering so much more value to advertisers in a sort of entirely measurable manner, they were essentially saying, well, yeah, we could, instead of spending budget here, we could spend it on free wall. That meant, essentially, and that budget was going down premium publishers, which meant that they could stop running less ads. We're beginning to speak to publishers saying, well, why don't you take all your banner ads off a page and just have one free wall a week? So from a user's point of view, give me a much better user experience. You're saying, well, look, you've got to come along and, pay a little bit of attention for once a week, but give me that bit of attention, 2 seconds, that's all I ask. But if you give that proper level of attention, that's actually more valuable than kind of perhaps glancing at 10 ads constantly all the time and they're flashing away at you. The amount of bandwidth taken up is a whole lot less. Quite often on a mobile phone, 70% of the data load is just ads, right? It's not actually the content. So we ended up with our model, if it actually, if we are able to grow as a company and deliver a lot more, we're still relatively small, should give the readers a much, much, much better user experience. It should allow content to remain free, which increasingly is unfortunately going behind paywalls because publishers have no other option. The free model is not working for them. And it gives advertisers a fantastic tool to advertise and communicate really, really effectively, and only pay when you get the kind of results that you want, right? And so it removes the huge amount of wastage that's generally there in digital advertising right now. The kind of sort of moving on to some extent now. One of the things, again, this is now a bit later in our journey as a company. So let's say about halfway through 2 and a bit years, 2 to 3 years. we began to realize that actually what FreeWall was is actually the ability to conduct a sort of micro conversation, right? Essentially the way it worked is you could ask a question, the user got to respond, and you got to respond again with that response image which came up. And with the conversation, micro conversation you can call it, we were using it to educate. But what we could also do was to learn, right? Because you could use that opportunity to engage in a sort of to learn about the users. And this has become really quite relevant right now because of everything regarding that's going on with data gathering, audience insights. That's becoming huge, right? Data is now becoming such a central part of any sort of marketing budget or thing. So we are beginning to focus quite a lot now on how we can deliver learnings to the people, our clients we work with. But this obviously is, when it talks about learning and audience insights, that's data, that's obviously now the GDPR is everywhere, you have to pay attention to it, you can't, it's not something that you can avoid if you're operating in Europe. And what we believe is actually, although we never started out with a sort of GDPR in mind when I first came up with the product, it actually works very well. But before we go into how our product's compliant and why it helps work within the GDPR sort of framework, I think it's just worth touching on privacy. I chose this slide because I thought it was quite funny. It has tons of CCTV cameras pointing at those poor women there. But actually, online it's worse. I mean, you know, you can be browsing, there are lots and lots of websites where if you turn on Ghostery or the sort of plugins that will show you the number of trackers, you'll have over 100 trackers. And these trackers are tracking your online activities, right? So it would be the equivalent of, you know, over 100 companies constantly being able to sort of take photographs or videoing you every time you go into any shop, anytime you buy anything, anytime you sort of browse a magazine in a railway station, every time you take a taxi, every time you get on the train, they know what you're doing, right? They know everything you're doing online and they can track it. And I think it's, I mean, personally, even though I'd say I'm in the advertising ecosystem and obviously this level of tracking helps, I actually personally think it's gone too far. And I think actually what the GDPR is trying to do is good. It's a bit like, you know, climate change and having to get rid of diesel engines, and it's a total pain to some extent, especially if billions are being poured into that kind of technology. But if you want a better future, you want a better world, it's change you have to go through. You know, it's third-party companies, yes, Google and Facebook play huge roles in this, but if it was the government doing this level of tracking on someone, you'd say you were living in a police state, right? That's what a police state is. The government knows everything you do. So I think it's GDPR is something that we should be embracing, just like we should be embracing kind of trying to reduce our CO2 footprint and things like that. And actually Apple with their ITP, which is Intelligent Tracking Prevention, are basically doing the same thing. It's a technical implementation, whereas GDPR is more of a legal framework, but they're both basically trying to say, look, you must reducing the amount of tracking going on is generally bad, right? Yes, there are some drawbacks to advertisers who have essentially become very data savvy in how they use data, because they're essentially saying, well, no, you won't have that much data now at that disposal, or you. But I think, you know, it'll apply equally to everybody, right, in the future. So just like. In that sense, it's always going to be a level playing field. In the past, you didn't have all this data, now you do. In the future, again, you might not have the data. But as long as, if your products are better than your competitors and you're doing an equally good job of getting your message out there, consumers will buy more of your product compared to your competitors. So in a sense, I think it's like, you know, the more the brands that embrace it and sort of do the right thing, I guess, I think will benefit from that in the future. Now, just coming on to just some of the subtleties of going back to GDPR now. In terms of harvesting and using a person's data, in the past, Most tech companies certainly, and I think even lots of brands relied on legitimate interest. But I don't know if you've been following it, but the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the regulator for the UK when it comes to data, released a report in the summer that said that a lot of this data collection and processing was based on a legitimate interest legal basis, which is not valid. Right? They said you cannot use legitimate interest. What you have to use is consent. Now this is actually a problem for a lot of brands because or advertisers. It's like, how do you get consent, and what does consent look like? And actually, consent it's actually quite clearly defined within the GDPR, and it's actually quite common sense. Consent basically is, the guideline says, it has to be freely given. You can't coerce someone to give consent, and it has to and the user needs to know, in a sort of common sense, they need to know who's collecting this data on them and how they're going to use it. Sort of fairly common sense. If someone came up to you on the street and said, would you like to tell me blah blah blah, you'd probably want to know who's collecting this information and why they're collecting that information. So but because of the way lots of publishers and advertisers work, consent is difficult because more often than not the data has been gathered sort of almost secretly, if you will, in the background as you're browsing around various websites. So let's say I browse around and I'm reading up lots of articles on photography. I'd immediately get put in a segment of a photo enthusiast, and then maybe I'd start receiving ads for cameras. Now, that might seem pretty innocuous in itself, and going, well, I can just sort of put them in a little segment. But a professor of, I think that's sort of something like data privacy at the Imperial College of London, has said that actually you only need about 15 segments before you can identify 99.99% of the population individually and specifically. Like an example for myself is like, for example, let's say I was in a segment that time of Indian ethnic origin. I live in Islington in London. I'm a parent of children. I'm a company director, and I did physics, or I'm interested in physics. I mean, that's about 5. You've probably got me by then. But if you speak to your average data management platform vendor or publishers, they will say, oh yeah, use us and we will create over 100 data points per person as they go around your website and things like that, because we can segment them up based on their behavior. We can connect them to other data sources, and before you know it, we can give you all this data about this person. But that actually is sort of, when you start getting that level of knowledge, when they say like Facebook knows you better than you know yourself kind of thing, or suddenly your partner knows you, and it's true, they know you scarily well. So I think, again, when the GDPR is saying is like that sort of constant data collection that's happening is, we'll have to stop, I think, if you want a sort of healthier society in the future. And we're kind of seeing that, right? It's sort of the whole fake news and how elections are being manipulated and things like that. It's all because this is happening in the background. So when it came to consent, we suddenly realized we could solve the problem for advertisers. So I'll show you 2 examples of how we're doing it for other brands. So Nestle and Bakers, they realized that obviously there are lots of data on pet owners based on people's behavior, but they said, well, if you want GDPR compliant data, how do we go about knowing whether a person is a pet owner and if they own a dog or a cat? We said, well, we've got a free world. We can say quite explicitly, Bakers and Nestle's would like to use this data to improve your advertising experience. What pets do you have? You can answer dog and cat, dog, no pets, not interested, cat. So you're fully, regardless of how you answer, the content would be released. So you can say not interested in no pets. So we are not, we sort of meet that first criteria of consent, which is it must be freely given. Actually, we find really good opt-in rates. 60 to 70% of people will give us the data. And actually, when we map it back to their actual own data sets, it matches really closely. So only a relative minority of people are saying not interested. Most people are actually quite happy to give you the data because they're going, well, actually, I do have a pet, or I have no pets, but I'd like, if that is going to deliver more relevant advertising to me for something I'm genuinely interested in, then I'm happy to provide that information. And I think this is where brands who have a strong relationship and you have a strong brand, it's much easier. We find that the stronger the brand is, the more likely and more that people are willing to share that data. And we did one with Pantene. This was about, they had actually come up with a shampoo that was particularly for this one, for the colored hair in need of repair. But obviously it felt a bit odd to just say, do you have colored hair in need of repair? So we sort of, the question was at the end of the day to just say, would you like some hair care tips? Tell us what type of hair you wanted. Now actually, as it turns out, they have products for the other types of hair, so we got data, and there's always the I'd rather not say option, so people could say I'd rather not say, but we were able to collect the data for the first point and feed it straight into their own data management platforms. There were the data controllers in that example, and they were able to send marketing messages, retarget those people with the specific product for their specific type of hair. So so that's how we feel like in the two big challenges we feel that our company has sort of set out to, well, the first challenge we set out to solve was the whole fixing the ecosystem, publisher monetization, more effective advertising. That we feel we've been doing now successfully for a while. The big current challenge of the day is the sort of GDPR, ICO data and all that. And it's a relatively recent product. We've been doing it for a little over a year, but it's only now beginning to gather steam in the sense we've got beginning to actually work with lots of clients on this front. In fact, I'd say, let's say about a year ago, all the campaigns that are being run with us were for advertising purely. Now it's actually 50-50. 50% of this is purely data collecting, but in a sort of fully GDPR compliant way. And that sort of basically brings us up to date on where we are. So, thank you. That's it.